The wedding dress had cost $4,000. Sarah Calloway knew this because her mother had told her the price 11 times in the 6 months between the engagement and the ceremony, each repetition carrying the specific weight of an investment that was not to be wasted, a number attached not to fabric and lace and hand-sewn beading, but to a decision, a future, a version of Sarah's life that her mother had been constructing since before Sarah had been old enough to have preferences about her own. The dress was ivory. It had a cathedral train that required 2 people to carry it, and a bodice so structured it functioned as its own kind of architecture, holding her upright, holding her in the shape the occasion required. She had tried it on 4 times in the fitting process, and each time she had looked in the mirror and seen someone who looked exactly like a bride, and nothing at all like herself. She had not said this out loud. She had said, "It's beautiful." She had said, "I love it." She had turned in the careful way the seamstress directed and held still while pins were adjusted, and she had looked at her mother's face in the mirror behind her, at the specific quality of satisfaction there, the relief of a plan coming together, and she had understood very clearly that the feeling in her own chest, the hollow, pressing, breathless feeling that had been there since the night Daniel slid the ring onto her finger in front of his entire family, and she had smiled until her face ached, was not something she was permitted to speak about. That had been the arrangement. Not spoken, not agreed to. Simply assumed, the way the most binding arrangements always were. Daniel Marsh was by every measurable standard an excellent choice. His family had money, old money, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because it had been present long enough to simply become part of the landscape. He was handsome in the uncomplicated way of someone who had always been handsome and had never had to develop anything else as compensation. He was not cruel. This was something Sarah had spent considerable effort appreciating. He was not cruel. He was not violent. He had never once raised his voice to her in 2 years of dating and 11 months of engagement. He was simply not someone she loved. She had tried to love him. She had approached the project of loving Daniel Marsh the way she approached most things, methodically and with genuine intent, looking for the specific combination of qualities that would unlock the feeling she understood she was supposed to have. She had found things to admire. His certainty, his ease in rooms full of people, the way he navigated the social world they inhabited with the comfortable authority of someone for whom it had always been navigated toward rather than away from. She had not found love. She had found instead a growing, quiet conviction, arriving one ordinary Tuesday like an invoice that had been delayed in the mail, that she was about to make a permanent decision based on someone else's understanding of what her life should be. The conviction had arrived in October. The wedding was in March. She had done nothing with the conviction except carry it, and it had grown heavier every week, and by the morning of the wedding it was the most substantial thing in the room, heavier than the dress on its padded hanger, heavier than her mother's careful happiness, heavier than the flowers delivered at 7 in ivory and white, heavier than the envelope on her vanity that contained the vows she had written and rewritten 6 times, and still didn't believe. She put on the dress. She let her mother fasten the 43 buttons up the back. She sat still while her hair was arranged, and her face was made into a more polished version of itself. She held her bouquet, and she looked in the mirror, and the hollow pressing feeling filled the entire room until she could barely breathe inside it. Downstairs, a car was waiting. Outside, the city was doing what March cities did: cold, provisional, the sky the non-committal gray of a season that hadn't decided yet. The river was visible from the window, the old river, the one that ran along the eastern edge of the historic district before it turned south toward the lower city, wide and dark. The kind of river that looked like it had been there before the city was built around it and would be there after. She looked at the river, and she thought about the vows on the vanity and the 43 buttons she would never be able to undo herself, and the hollow in her chest that she had been carrying since October. The car horn sounded from the street below. Sarah Calloway picked up her dress with both hands, walked out of the bedroom, down the back stairs, through the kitchen, and out the service entrance of the building that her mother had rented for the bridal preparations. And she ran. She didn't have a plan. This was the thing that would strike her later, looking back, as both the most reckless and the most honest thing about what she did. She was 26 years old and she had spent 26 years having a plan, or rather having her mother's plan, and when she walked out of that building into the March cold in $4,000 of ivory silk, she had nothing except the dress on her body and the particular clarity that arrives when the pressure of a contained feeling finally exceeds the container. She walked fast. Then, she ran. The cathedral train was impossible to run in properly. She gathered it in both arms, holding it against her chest like a bundle of laundry, the beaded hem dragging over wet pavement wherever she couldn't hold it high enough, and she ran east toward the river, because east was away from the venue and away from the car, and away from the receiving hall full of flowers and Daniel's family and her mother's careful investment in this particular future. The streets in the historic district were still cobblestone, and cobblestone in March in heeled shoes was not a forgiving surface. She lost one shoe in the second block and didn't stop to retrieve it. She lost the other one at the corner where the road dropped toward the river path, and she kept going in bare feet on cold, wet stone, the train beginning to come loose from where she'd pinned it for the walk, beginning to trail behind her properly now, white against gray pavement, the most visible person in the city. She heard a car behind her. She didn't look back. She turned off the main road onto the river path, the narrow walkway that ran along the eastern bank, the wrought iron railing between the path and the water, the river below it very black and very cold in the March morning light. She stopped at the railing. Her breath came hard. Her feet were numb on the cold stone. The dress was soaked at the hem, heavy with the wet, and her hair had come partially down from its careful arrangement, and her hands on the railing were shaking, and for the first time since she'd left the building, she allowed herself to fully feel what she was feeling, which was not triumph, not freedom, not the clean, uncomplicated relief she'd imagined. It was terror, not of Daniel, not of the wedding. Terror of herself, of what she'd just done, of the fact that she was standing on a river path in a wedding dress, with no shoes and no phone and no plan, and the most significant day of her mother's life was unraveling in real time 4 blocks west of here. And underneath the terror, somewhere deeper, quieter, so small she almost missed it, something that felt like the first honest breath she'd taken in 11 months. She gripped the railing and looked at the river. The water was black the way deep rivers were black in winter, not the absence of color, but the presence of depth, the dark that came from coldness and age, and the specific opacity of water that had been running through stone channels since before the city above it was imagined. It moved fast. She could see the current even from the path above, the subtle muscular movement of water that had somewhere to be and was getting there regardless. She heard footsteps on the path behind her. Fast, male, more than one person. She looked back. 2 men in formal suits, moving quickly along the river path toward her. Daniel's people, she recognized the elder one, the family's estate manager. She'd met him at 3 separate dinners. They'd found her. She looked at the river. She looked at the men approaching. She thought about the 43 buttons and the vows she hadn't believed, and the hollow in her chest and her mother's investment, and the ring on her finger that she had never once looked at without feeling something she could only describe as wrong. She climbed the railing. Later she would tell people, the few people she eventually told, that she had not intended to jump, that she had climbed the railing as a gesture, a demonstration to make the men stop approaching, that she had not actually planned to go into the water. She was never entirely sure this was true. What was true was that the stone path was wet, and her bare feet had no grip, and when the older man lunged forward to grab her arm, he caught the dress instead, and the dress pulled, and the railing was slick, and the March morning tipped sideways, and then there was nothing beneath her except cold air, and then there was nothing beneath her at all. The river hit her like a wall. The cold was so absolute, and so total, that it wasn't cold in the way cold usually presented itself. Not a sensation so much as a system failure. Her body's entire processing capacity rerouting to deal with the water that was inside her dress and in her hair, and filling the space between the beaded fabric and her skin with liquid ice. The current took her immediately. She had been a competent swimmer in a pool, in warm water, in a swimsuit. She was none of those things now. She went under. The dress was the problem. $4,000 of ivory silk and structure, and 43 buttons, and a cathedral train was now wrapped around her legs, around her arms, heavy and clinging, and the current was strong and the water was very dark, and she could not find the surface with any reliability. She found it twice, gasping, lost it again. She stopped fighting the dress. She stopped fighting the current. The river had her, and the river was not negotiating, and she had about enough coherent thought remaining to register that this was an extremely poor outcome for a person who had left a wedding in order to start living honestly, before the dark water pulled her under one final time. Something hit the water near her. Not near. With her, something entered the water beside her, and the current changed, displaced, and then something that was not the river had her, had both arms, was pulling upward with a force that the current couldn't argue with, that the dress couldn't argue with, that the cold and the dark had no framework to resist. She came out of the water. Air. She took it in great ragged pulls, the kind of breathing that was less choice than reflex, her body overriding everything in favor of oxygen. She was being held. She registered this distantly, held above the surface of the water by something that had both arms around her from behind, moving toward the bank with the unhurried power of something that was not impaired by cold or current or the considerable dead weight of a waterlogged cathedral train wedding dress. The bank came up. Stone steps. She felt them under her feet, water pouring off everything. She was set down on the lower landing of the river stairs, the kind of steps built into the old stone retaining wall for the use of the old city's river trade, rarely used now, slick with winter moss. She coughed for a long time. Then she sat on the cold steps and breathed and shook and looked at the river she had just come out of. Then she looked at what had pulled her out of it. He was crouching at the edge of the landing, one step above her, looking at her with the particular focused intensity of someone assessing whether a rescued person was going to require further intervention. He was tall. She could see this, even with him crouching, genuinely tall, long-limbed, the kind of proportions that were slightly outside the normal range. He had dark hair, soaking wet now, falling past his collar, pushed back from his face with one hand. His skin was pale in the early morning light. Not the pallor of cold. She was pale with cold, and it looked entirely different, but the pallor of something that simply ran differently than human skin. His eyes were dark, very dark. The specific darkness of deep water in a confined space. Not black, but something adjacent to it, and they were watching her with a clarity and steadiness that she could feel as a physical thing, a quality of being seen that was more complete than she was used to. He was soaking wet, and he was not shivering. The water poured off his clothes, dark clothes, good ones, the kind of clothes that belonged at a different kind of event than an emergency river extraction, and made rivers of their own on the stone steps around him, and he was completely, entirely still. "Are you injured?" he said. His voice was low and measured, not cold, precise, the way a very composed person was precise when composure was required. She ran a comprehensive internal inventory. Physically, thoroughly soaked, feet completely numb, the beginnings of true cold setting into her core, no specific pain beyond the general violence of the river. The dress was destroyed. She thought about this, and found she felt nothing about it. $4,000 of ivory silk, ruined, and she felt exactly nothing. "No," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected, scraped by river water and cold air. He looked at her for another moment. Then, He sat on the step beside her, not touching, but in the way of someone who has decided to be present and is not apologizing for it. He reached inside his jacket somehow. His jacket had retained a dry interior pocket and produced a folded cloth, offered it to her. She took it. It was small for what she needed, but she pressed it to her face anyway, wiped river water from her eyes. "The men on the path," she said. "Gone," he said simply. "When I went in after you, they left." She looked up at the river path above them. Empty. The wrought iron railing where she'd climbed. The wet stone. No formal suits, no estate manager, no evidence that the last 10 minutes had happened except the state of her and the state of him and the river moving past below them as if it had already forgotten. "You went in after me," she said. "Yes, in those clothes." It seemed like the more pressing concern, he said. She looked at him, at the water still dripping from his hair, at the dark clothes that had gone into the river because she had gone into the river. "Why?" she said. He looked at her directly, not unkindly, not with the specific careful gentleness that people deployed when dealing with someone in crisis, the gentle that was also a kind of distance, a protective layer between the helper and the helped. This was something different, more direct. "Because you were drowning," he said, as if this were sufficient, as if the explanation were its own completion. She looked at the river. She was beginning to shake in earnest now, the cold that had been held back by shock beginning to arrive with full authority. Her teeth pressed together to keep them from chattering and failed. He stood, shrugged off his jacket. It was ruined, completely waterlogged, pulling at his shoulders, but it was warmer than the air, and he held it out to her, and she took it, because she was past having opinions about the propriety of accepting wet jackets from strangers who had just pulled her from rivers. It settled over her shoulders. "I need to get you somewhere warm," he said. "I can't go back," she said. Immediately, without thinking, he looked at her for a moment. There was no judgment in the look, no assessment of the decision she'd made or the method she'd used to make it, or the $4,000 dress that was currently doing its best to anchor her to the stone steps. Just the look of someone processing information and deciding what to do with it. "I know," he said, and she believed him, which was the strangest thing about all of it. She believed him completely, with the specific certainty that bypassed the part of the brain that normally handled certainty that arrived in the body before the mind had finished processing. She got up, her bare feet on the cold stone, the ruined dress, the wet jacket over her shoulders. "Come," he said. He didn't offer his hand. He simply turned and began up the stone steps, and she followed, and the river path above them was empty, and the city was still barely awake, and somewhere 4 blocks west the receiving hall was full of flowers, and a question no one knew how to answer yet. She did not look back. He took her to a house. Not immediately. There were 3 blocks between the river stairs and wherever they were going, 3 blocks of cobblestone and early morning gray, and Sarah dripping river water and holding her train up with one hand and trying to keep the wet jacket on her shoulders with the other, her bare feet on cold stone again. And she registered none of this as uncomfortable in the way it should have been, because the cold had gone past the point of sensation, and because the part of her that managed normal responses to things was still somewhere back on the river path, still processing. He walked beside her, not ahead, not guiding, beside, at a pace that matched hers exactly, which she noticed because it required calibration, because her pace was uneven, the dress, the cold, the fading adrenaline, and he adjusted to it without appearing to adjust. The house was on the far edge of the historic district. She'd lived in this city her entire life, and she had never walked this particular street. It ran along the northern boundary of the old quarter, set back from the main roads, accessible through an alley she wouldn't have identified as a through route without someone who knew it was one. The houses here were older than the ones on the streets she knew, a different category of old, stone rather than brick, set behind walls rather than simply railings, built with the specific intention of a certain kind of privacy. His was the last one on the row. The gate opened when he touched it, not with a key, just a touch, his hand on the iron and the mechanism releasing, and she filed this in the part of her that was still collecting information, the part that hadn't stopped working even when the rest of her was underwater. The garden inside was dark with early spring bare structured plantings, the kind that would be extraordinary later and were only themselves now, all architecture and bare branch. The front door opened before they reached it. A woman in the doorway. Dark hair, composed expression, pale complexion. She looked at Sarah with the specific assessment of someone who was accustomed to their employer's unexpected arrivals and had long ago learned to respond practically rather than reactively. She was in the river, he said. No further explanation offered or apparently required. Dry clothes, the woman said. Not a question. Already turning. Fire in the east room. I'll bring tea. The inside of the house was warm. This was the first thing she registered properly actual warmth. The kind that had depth to it. Old stone that had been heated for a long time and had absorbed it into its structure. She stood in the entrance and felt the warmth begin to work on the cold in her core, the shaking intensifying for a moment the way it did when a cold body began to believe warmth was possible. Before settling, the floors were stone with heavy rugs. The walls were dark wood paneling above stone. There was art, not decorative art. The kind that people put in houses because houses required art, but the kind that appeared to have arrived specifically, chosen for specific reasons, each piece placed with intention. A staircase with a stone balustrade. A ceiling that was higher than the exterior of the house seemed to promise. Come, he said. The east room was a sitting room with a fireplace that was already lit. The fire not new, already established and steady, giving off the particular quality of heat that came from a fire that had been burning for a while rather than one hastily started. 2 chairs. A small table between them, bookshelves on the wall not covered in books but interspersed with them, objects and books together, the collection of a person who read and also moved through the world acquiring things. She stood in the middle of the room, and water dripped from the hem of her dress onto the stone floor. I'll get dry clothes, he said, and then you're going to tell me what happened. She looked at him. He said it plainly. Not an interrogation. Not the solicitous, careful tone of someone managing a fragile situation. Just a straightforward statement of what was going to happen next, offered in the same register he'd used to tell her the men on the path were gone. You pulled me out of a river, she said. You don't owe me an explanation. No, he said. But I'd like one. He left the room. She stood by the fire and felt the warmth move up her body from the floor and thought about the vows on her vanity and the ring on her finger. Still there. She looked at it. Still there. And the hollow in her chest that had been there since October. The woman appeared with dry clothes, not formal, not elaborate. A soft dark shirt and trousers that were too long for Sarah, but that were warm and clean and entirely welcome. She also brought a towel and disappeared with the tact of someone who understood that what was required was a door closing. Sarah changed. The dress came off with difficulty, 43 buttons defeating her, until she remembered that she could simply pull, that it didn't matter anymore, that the dress's structural integrity was no longer any concern of hers, and she pulled, and buttons scattered on the stone floor, and the ivory silk dropped in a heap around her feet, and she stepped out of it and stood for a moment looking at it. $4,000. 43 buttons. 6 months of her mother's investment. She left it on the floor and put on the dry clothes and sat in the chair nearest the fire. He came back. He'd changed as well, dry now, dark clothes again, the formality of the earlier ones replaced with something quieter. He sat across from her. The woman brought tea and set it between them and left without commentary. You're not going to ask why I was in a river in a wedding dress. Sarah said, I thought I'd let you decide how much of it to tell me, he said. She looked at the fire, at the tea, at her own hands, warming slowly, the ring on her left hand catching the firelight. She told him. Not all of it, not the whole weight of it, but enough. The engagement. The hollow feeling. October, the vows she'd rewritten 6 times. The dress and the buttons and the 43 and the car waiting outside and the moment when she'd understood, with a completeness that didn't allow for negotiation, that she could not go through with it. He listened the way very few people listened, without waiting for his turn to speak, without preparing his response while she was still talking, with the specific quality of attention that felt like being read carefully, slowly, by someone who understood that rushing would miss something. When she finished, the fire had settled lower in the grate. "You're not wearing the ring anymore," he said. She looked at her hand. She'd taken it off at some point while she was talking. It sat on the table beside her tea. She hadn't noticed removing it. "No," she said. He looked at the ring on the table. Then, at her. "You jumped into a river to get out," he said. "Not the most efficient exit." "I didn't plan it," she said. "I know," he said. "Planning would have involved shoes." She looked at him. He looked back. Something in his expression, not a smile exactly, something more controlled than a smile, something that lived adjacent to amusement the way his features lived adjacent to the expected range of human expression, slightly outside it, slightly more precise. "What's your name?" she said. "Riven," he said. "Riven Ashvale." She held that, filed it. "Sarah," she said. "Calloway." "I know," he said. The ring. The engraving. Of course, she'd forgotten the ring had her name on the inside, a detail Daniel had arranged without consulting her, one of the many small arrangements that had been made in her name without her input. "I can't go home," she said. "Not today." "No," he agreed. "You can stay here." She looked at him. At the stillness, at the pale skin, and the dark eyes that had pulled her out of a river without hesitating, and had listened to her without performing listening. At the house that was warm in the way of somewhere that had been warm for a very long time. "You don't know me," she said. "You didn't know me either," he said. "You came inside anyway." She looked at the fire. "Thank you," she said, "for the river, and the clothes, and the listening, and the fire. All of it at once." "You're mine now," he said. Quietly, without elaboration. Not his. The fire made its small sounds. She didn't answer. She picked up her tea. She looked at the ring sitting on the table, and felt nothing. And looked at the fire, and felt something. And sat in the warmth of the oldest house she'd ever been in, and breathed. She slept in a room on the 2nd floor with a window that faced the garden. She hadn't expected to sleep. She'd expected to lie in the dark and process everything: the wedding, the river, the ring on the table downstairs, her phone, which was somewhere in her mother's rented apartment 4 blocks from the venue, and which was almost certainly generating a quantity of missed calls that she was not emotionally equipped to face. She'd expected the adrenaline aftermath to keep her awake, the body's inevitable accounting for the morning's expenditure. She was asleep within minutes of lying down. She slept deeply, in the way that followed significant physical and emotional exhaustion, the kind of sleep that was less rest than shutdown, her body simply removing her from consciousness for the duration required. She dreamed vaguely, and forgot it on waking. When she woke, the light through the window had the quality of late afternoon. She had slept for hours. She lay for a moment looking at the ceiling. Stone, like everything else in this house, with the faint variation of surface that came from age rather than manufacture. Above her the ceiling was exactly itself, not decorated, not performing, simply present in the way that things built to last were present, without apology for existing. She thought about what Riven had said. "You're mine now," not his. She should have found this alarming. She had a comprehensive list of reasons why those words, spoken by a stranger whose house she was sleeping in after he'd pulled her from a river, should have been alarming. She ran through the list methodically, as she'd been trained to run through things by years of a life that valued the methodical. She did not find it alarming. She found it, in a way she couldn't entirely account for, the truest thing anyone had said to her in 11 months. Not possessive in the way the words might have sounded from someone else, but declarative in the way a fact was declarative. Something being named that already existed, rather than claimed from outside. She got up, washed her face at the basin in the corner of the room, ran her fingers through her hair, still slightly damp at the ends. The careful arrangement of the morning reduced now to simply her actual hair, which had always looked better like this than it had in the arrangements her mother preferred. She opened the bedroom door and stood in the corridor, listening. The house had a particular quiet. Not empty quiet. She'd spent enough time in empty places to know the acoustic quality of absence, but inhabited quiet. The quiet of a place where someone was present and at rest. She followed the corridor to the staircase and went down. The east room was lit, the fire rebuilt and burning steadily. On the small table between the chairs, a plate of food had been left, covered with a cloth, warm when she uncovered it. Bread and something braised, simple and substantial, the kind of food that said we knew you would wake up hungry rather than what would you like. She ate standing by the fire. Halfway through, she became aware that she was not alone. She didn't hear him enter. She simply became aware, the way you became aware of weather changing not a specific moment, but a shift in the quality of the air, a presence announcing itself through the atmosphere rather than through sound. She turned. Riven was in the doorway, leaning against the frame, arms loosely crossed, watching her eat with an expression she was beginning to learn to read, the specific arrangement of his features that indicated he was paying attention and not bothering to conceal it. "You slept," he said. "I did." She looked at the plate. Someone left food. "Vera," he said. She anticipated. She's good at that. She's had time to learn. She looked at him. At the words that kept arriving in that way, the implications left open rather than closed, the phrasing that suggested more than it stated and expected her to notice. She noticed. "How long has she worked for you?" she said. "Vera," he said. 22 years. And before her? A pause. Others for a long time. She ate the last of the bread, set the plate down, turned to face him properly. "You're going to have to explain some things," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know. Not tonight," she said. Not because she was afraid of the explanation, but because tonight she was still made of river water and adrenaline and the aftermath of a decision she had made without a plan, and she needed one more night of simple warmth before she was ready for whatever complicated truth lived in this house. "Not tonight," he agreed. She looked at the fire. "My phone is at the apartment. My mother is..." She stopped. Thought about her mother. About the $4,000 dress on the floor of the east room. About the specific texture of her mother's worry, which was real and genuine and wrapped around a framework of expectation that Sarah had never had the heart to fully dismantle. "Your mother knows you're alive," he said. She looked at him sharply. "I sent someone to make contact. Anonymously. She knows you're safe." He said it with the calm of someone reporting a completed task. "She doesn't know where you are." "You." She stopped. "How did you know to do that?" "Because you were going to lie awake worrying about it," he said simply. "And you needed to sleep." She held that, held the specific quality of it, of being known in that way, of a decision being made on her behalf that was actually on her behalf rather than on behalf of someone's plan for her. "You made that decision without asking me," she said. Not accusatory. "Exploring, yes," he said. "I can apologize for that if you'd prefer." She thought about it. "No," she said. "You were right about what I needed." He nodded, accepting this without making more of it than it was. "I'm going to need clothes," she said. Tomorrow, mine or she didn't finish that sentence. Her clothes were in her apartment, and her apartment was a conversation she wasn't ready for yet. "Vera can arrange it." I'll pay for them. Of course, he said, the way someone said of course when they meant it as a recognition rather than an accommodation. Not you don't need to, but yes, of course, that's the right thing. She looked around the room, at the bookshelves, the objects, the particular density of things collected over time by someone who paid attention to what they acquired. A small stone figure on one shelf that was old enough that she couldn't immediately place its period. A set of maps behind glass on the far wall, cartographic rather than decorative, actual working maps from an era when maps were the primary technology for navigating an uncertain world. Those maps, she said. He looked at them. Yes, the oldest one. That she moved closer. Looked at the cartouche in the corner, the date notation. That's from the 16th century. Yes, it's in extraordinary condition. I've kept it carefully, he said. She looked at the map, at the city it depicted, the city she'd grown up in, rendered in an earlier version of itself, the river in a slightly different course. The historic district not yet built, the land above the old river bend still open. She looked at the detail, the hand-drawn quality, the particular richness of the ink. You have a lot of old things, she said. Yes, he said. Very old. Yes, she turned from the map. Looked at him directly. Tomorrow, she said. You explain. He held her gaze. Tomorrow, he agreed. She went back to the fire, sat in the chair that had become her chair in the 6 hours she'd been in this house. Tucked her feet beneath her. The borrowed clothes were soft against her skin. The fire was warm. The house held its deep quiet around her. She thought about the ring on the table. She'd pick it up tomorrow and figure out what to do with it. Tonight it could stay where it was a removed thing, sitting quietly, no longer part of her story. She thought about your mine now, not his. She thought about the particular steadiness of a person who went into a cold river in good clothes without hesitating, and who thought to send someone to tell her mother she was alive before she woke up. She thought about tomorrow. Tomorrow arrived in the form of rain. She woke to the sound of it against the window glass, a steady March rain with the ambition of something trying to complete what the season had left unfinished, washing the last of winter from the stone streets. She lay in the bed and listened to it, and felt, with some surprise, that she was not dreading the day. She found Riven in a room she hadn't seen yet, at the back of the house, a room that was part library and part something else, a working space, papers on a large desk and more maps on the walls and a window that looked into the rain-gray garden. He was reading, one leg crossed over the other, entirely still in the way she was beginning to expect. The specific quality of stillness that she was accumulating observations about and not yet ready to draw conclusions from. He looked up when she came in. Tea, he said. It was on the small table beside the other chair. She sat and poured and picked up the cup and looked at him over the rim of it. Tell me, she said. He set his book down. He told her the way she suspected he told most things in order, with precision, without performing either casualness or gravity, simply giving her the information with the expectation that she would handle it according to her own capacity. He was old. This was the first thing, and it was the thing around which everything else organized itself. Old in a way that the word old didn't properly contain, in a way that required her to temporarily suspend her framework for what old meant and construct a new one. Not centuries. Longer than centuries. He said the number plainly, without drama, and she sat with it for a moment, the way you sat with very large numbers in mathematics, letting the scale register properly before proceeding. He was not human. Or not only human, or not human in the current sense. He had been human, once, in the way that a river had once been rain. The origin was real, but the current form was something else, something shaped by what it had moved through. The word he used was the obvious one, the word that came with a great deal of cultural furniture she was going to have to sort through for what was accurate and what was accumulated mythology. She sat with that too. The cold in the river, she said. It didn't affect you. No. The men on the path left when you went in after me. They recognized what I was, he said. Or sensed it. People often do, even without understanding what they're sensing. You sent someone to my mother without sending a person. You did it yourself, without leaving this house. He looked at her with the quality of attention she was learning to read as respect. Yes, he said. Correct, she thought about the maps on the wall. The 16th century map. I drew it, he said. She set down her cup, looked at the map on the wall, then at him. You drew it, she said. I was navigating unfamiliar territory at the time, he said. I found it useful to make records. She processed this. She noted with a certain detachment, not frightened. She was alert, she was running at a higher processing capacity than usual, she was doing the particular work of revising her framework for reality in real time, which was demanding but not frightening. What do you want from me? She said. Directly, because it was the direct question, and she had spent 11 months not asking direct questions, and she was done with that. He held her gaze. Nothing that isn't freely given, he said. That's not a careful answer. It's the accurate one. Then why am I here? Because you were drowning, he said. And because, he paused, chose words with the deliberateness she was starting to recognize as habitual, as the practice of someone who had learned that words said to people who mattered had consequence, and deserved to be chosen accordingly. Because you were drowning, and when I pulled you out and you looked at me, you were not afraid. And that, another pause. That hasn't happened in a very long time. She held that, thought about what she'd felt on the river steps, looking at him. The assessment she'd done, the inventory, the not frightened that had been there, and that she'd noted and filed. I'm practical by nature, she said. I was cold, and you were warm, and you didn't look threatening. I'm aware it may have been circumstantial, he said, and something in how he said it, the quality of it, the slight exposure beneath the precision told her it wasn't entirely circumstantial, and he knew it. What did you mean last night? She said. What you said. You're mine now. He was quiet. It sounded like a declaration, she said. Not a threat. A statement of something you believed was already true. Yes, he said. Based on a few hours, he agreed. And on certain things that I have learned to pay attention to, over a very long time, about the way people enter a room and look at maps and eat their dinner standing by a fire. He looked at her steadily. I'm not asking you to accept it. I'm explaining what I meant. She looked at the rain against the window. I just left a wedding, she said. I left a 2-year relationship. I have a great deal of things to figure out. Practical things, real-world things. My mother and my apartment, and what I do with a ring that has my name engraved inside it. She looked at him. I'm not in a position to make any kind of declaration back. I know, he said. But I'm not leaving today, she said. He looked at her. I'm practical, she said again. I have no phone and no shoes and clothes that belong to someone in your household, and there's rain. Leaving today would be impractical. Yes, he said, in the tone of someone who understood that practical was the framework she was using to describe something that wasn't entirely practical. So I'll stay another day, she said, and you'll tell me more. About what this is. About what you are. About what you meant. Yes, he said, and you won't make any further declarations until I have better context. Agreed, he said. And then, very slightly, you can keep the clothes. She looked at him. The not quite smile, the precision of it, the specific quality of humor that lived in the neighboring house to amusement and occasionally looked out the window. She picked up her tea. One more day. Then she'd figure out the rest. One more day became 4. She called her mother on the second day. Riven found her a phone without being asked. A small device, clean and charged, set beside her morning tea with no commentary, and she picked it up and stared at it for 20 minutes before she dialed. The conversation was exactly as difficult as she'd known it would be, and easier in one specific way she hadn't anticipated, which was that she was no longer afraid of her mother's disappointment. She had been afraid of it for so long, through so many small daily accommodations and silences and agreements, that she had forgotten it was a learned response rather than a necessary one. She had jumped into a river. Her mother's disappointment, arriving down a phone line from a rented apartment 4 blocks from a receiving hall full of wilting flowers, was something she could hold without being crushed by it. She was not unkind. She was honest, which was different from unkind even when it felt similar on arrival. She told her mother that she was safe, that she was sorry for the manner of her exit, that she understood the practical complications she'd created, and that she could not have done differently. Her mother cried. Sarah held the phone and let her mother's grief be what it was, which was real, which deserved space, which was not Sarah's responsibility to resolve. She told her she would call again tomorrow. She meant it. When she ended the call, she sat for a long time with the phone in her hands, looking at the rain-washed garden through the window. "How was it?" Riven said from the doorway. "Hard," she said. "Right," he nodded. Came no further into the room. He had a quality that she was accumulating observations about the ability to be present without crowding, to offer company without requiring response, to inhabit the same space as her without creating pressure in it. She had spent 2 years with someone who crowded every room he was in, not aggressively, not consciously, simply through the sheer certainty of himself, the way Daniel's presence always seemed to reduce the available oxygen slightly, to make Sarah smaller without trying. This was different. On the 3rd day, she asked to see more of the house. He showed her. It was larger than she'd understood from the entrance and the east room and the library. There were rooms she hadn't seen, corridors that extended further than the exterior suggested, the particular architectural quality of very old buildings that had been added to and adapted across centuries by people with different needs, but the same basic structure to work with. She understood, moving through it, that it had been a different kind of building at some point, something larger, something with a different relationship to the street, reduced over time to something that fit the current city's expectations, while retaining its interior complexity. There were rooms full of things. Not a hoarder's chaos organized, considered, the accumulation of a person who moved through the world and kept what mattered. She asked about specific things, and he answered, and the answers contained centuries that she was learning to hear without flinching. A chair from the 17th century that he'd been given by a man he'd known for 40 years before the man died. A painting by someone whose name she recognized from art history, painted in a year when Riven had apparently been in that city for other reasons. "You knew him," she said, looking at the painting. "The painter." "Briefly," he said. He painted fast and thought slowly. We argued about whether those tendencies were in conflict. "Who won the argument?" "He did," Riven said. "He was right. Moving fast is only a problem if it takes you somewhere you shouldn't be." She looked at him, at the specific way he'd said it. "Is that what you thought about this morning?" She said. "When you went into the river after me, I thought you were drowning," he said. "There wasn't much else." She turned back to the painting. "What did you think afterward?" "When you'd pulled me out and I wasn't afraid of you." He was quiet for a long moment. "That something had changed," he said, "that the quality of the morning was different than it had been before." She looked at the painting, at the confident brushwork, the speed and accuracy of it. On the 4th day, Daniel came. She heard the knock at the front gate from the library, where she was reading Riven's collection, working her way along a shelf with the specific, focused pleasure of someone who had been given access to something extraordinary and was approaching it systematically. She heard the knock, and she heard Vera's footsteps, and she heard the brief exchange at the gate, the words too low to make out, but the tone clear enough. She came down to the entrance hall. Daniel was outside the gate. She could see him through the iron bars from the entrance, his coat, his bearing, his particular quality of certainty. A man who had spent his entire life moving through the world as if it had been arranged for his passage. He was not angry. She noted this. He looked controlled and slightly bewildered, and as if the bewilderment was an insult he hadn't expected. Riven appeared beside her. She hadn't heard him come. He was simply there, beside her, slightly behind, close enough that she was aware of his presence without being crowded by it. "Do you want to speak to him?" he said quietly. She looked at Daniel through the gate, at the ring that was still on the table in the East Room, a question she hadn't answered yet, at the man she had spent 2 years trying to love and had not succeeded. "No," she said. Riven looked at Vera. A slight movement of his head. Vera turned back to the gate, said something to Daniel, and Daniel's expression shifted, not anger, something closer to recalibration, the face of someone updating a map that had turned out to be wrong. He left. She stood in the entrance hall for a moment after he'd gone. "He'll come back," she said. "Probably," Riven agreed. "I'll need to speak to him eventually. It's the right thing to do." "Yes, not today." "No," he said. "Not today." She turned from the entrance, went back toward the library. "I'll need to get my things from the apartment," she said as she walked. "Eventually, my books. My work, I work from home. I do translation work, literary translation. I need my computer and my notes." She was talking practically, because practical was the structure she was using to navigate the fact that she had been in this house for 4 days and was not thinking about leaving it. "Of course," he said. "When you're ready." She stopped at the library door, turned. "I'm going to stay a little longer," she said. He looked at her. "Practically," she said. "My apartment situation is there are complications, and it's easier to handle the Daniel situation from neutral ground, and I'm not finished with the shelf." He looked at her with the quality of attention she'd come to understand as his most direct form of communication. "Of course," he said. "So," she said, "I'll stay." "Yes," he said. "You'll stay." She went back to the shelf, found her page, read. Outside the rain had stopped, and the garden was doing what gardens did after rain, drinking it in, making use of it, converting the water into the slow green business of becoming. She got her things on a Thursday. Not all of them. The apartment wasn't resolved yet. The lease had 3 months left on it and she'd paid it, and she wasn't going to walk away from a paid lease. She told herself this firmly, and believed it with about 60% of her available conviction. But her laptop, her translation notes, the 3 boxes of books that constituted her working library, her clothes, which Vera had offered to collect, and which Sarah had insisted on collecting herself, because there were things she needed to see with her own eyes, and her apartment was one of them. It was smaller than she remembered. She stood in the entrance to it on Thursday afternoon and looked at the space she'd lived in for 3 years, the carefully arranged evidence of a life she'd built on the assumption of a trajectory that was now defunct, and she felt not grief exactly, not loss. Something more like the feeling of standing at the end of a path and understanding that the path had been real, had been genuinely traveled, and had ended here at a gate, and that through the gate there was a different direction. She packed methodically, her books first, because books were the primary thing, then her work materials, then her clothes. She moved through the apartment with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided and was implementing the decision without reopening it. On the kitchen table she left the ring. She'd brought it from the East Room in Riven's house that morning, carrying it in her coat pocket, the weight of it small and specific. She'd thought about sending it back through a solicitor, through a formal channel, the correct and proper way. She'd thought about this, and then she'd set it on the kitchen table with a note that said simply, "I'm sorry for the manner of this. I should have told you sooner. The ring is yours to return or keep." She signed her name. She left. She was at the street door with her first box of books when her phone rang. Her own phone, retrieved from the apartment, fully charged now. Daniel, she stood on the step with the box in her arms and looked at his name on the screen. She thought about what she'd told Riven. I'll need to speak to him eventually. It's the right thing to do. She put the box down. She answered. It was not the conversation she'd expected. She had expected anger, or the controlled performance of injury, or the particular quality of Daniel's certainty deployed against her. The way he'd always been most certain in the moments when she'd most needed space to be uncertain. She had prepared for that conversation. He was quiet instead. He asked if she was all right. The question was genuine. She could hear this, the sincerity underneath the hurt. He asked if there was someone. She thought about how to answer this. I don't know yet, she said, which was honest, and he deserved honesty. He was quiet for a moment. Then, were you happy? Before. With me. She looked at the street, at the city she'd grown up in, the buildings she knew, the particular quality of afternoon light in March when the clouds broke. I wasn't unhappy, she said. I want you to know that's true. But I wasn't myself. I don't think I knew how to be myself and also be what you needed. Another silence. Then, okay. Just that. Okay. The word carrying the weight of someone standing at their own gate, their own path ending, their own recalibration and progress. I'm sorry, she said. I know, he said. Me too. They ended the call. She stood on the step for another moment and felt the clean, difficult settling of a thing completed. Not resolve the complications of 2 years didn't resolve in a phone call. The practical and emotional work of the unraveling would take time. But completed, in the sense of a seal placed on a letter, the content acknowledged, and its circulation begun. She picked up her box. Went back to loading. Riven had sent a car. She hadn't asked for it. It had appeared at the street door when she'd arrived. A dark car with a quiet driver who loaded the boxes without being asked, and who waited with the patience of someone who did not have questions about the situation. She had stood there and looked at the car and thought about what it was like to be anticipated, to have someone understand what you would need before you knew you needed it, and had gotten into the car without saying anything because there wasn't anything to say. She arrived back at the house on the hill in the late afternoon. Riven was in the garden. She saw him through the gate before she went in, standing near the far wall where something was espaliered against the stone, examining it with the specific focused interest of someone who knew what they were looking at. He was in a dark coat lighter than the one he'd given to her in the river, the weather having decided it was willing to allow March to be something other than hostile, and his dark hair was loose past his collar, and he stood with a particular quality of stillness that no longer surprised her, that she'd learned to read as attention rather than detachment. He looked up. How was it? He said. Done, she said. Good. Properly done. He nodded, looked back at the wall. She came through the gate, stood beside him, looked at what he was looking at, which appeared to be a vine of some kind, very old, the main trunk of it thick and gnarled against the stone. What is this? She said. Wisteria, he said. It doesn't flower until late spring, but the structure is. He gestured at the way it was trained along the wall, the decades-long architecture of the growing. It takes a long time to get the shape right. You have to direct it early and then leave it alone. She looked at the vine. At the old wood of the main trunk, the newer growth layered over it, the whole thing trained along the wall in a form that was both natural and deliberate. How long have you had this? She said. The vine itself is 60 years old, he said. I brought it here from another house. It took 3 years to establish itself in the new wall. She thought about the moving of a 60-year-old vine, the patience of it, the commitment to something that required 3 years just to settle. You're good at the long view, she said. I've had to be, he said. She looked at him, at the pale profile, the dark hair, the quality of him in the garden light. I called Daniel, she said. I know, he said. He said it not as surveillance, but as she'd left her door open when she made the call, had known he could hear her, had done this consciously. It's done, she said. Properly, he turned to look at her. Good, he said. And then, quieter, the thing he said once more, the declaration he'd made on the river steps and hadn't repeated since. You're mine now. She looked at him, let herself look at him fully, the way she hadn't let herself look at anything fully in 11 months. The way she'd been practicing here in this house, this garden, this warm room, the practice of looking at things honestly and letting them be what they were. I'm starting to think that might be true, she said. The wisteria vine held its old shape against the stone wall. The garden was quiet around them. The city below the hill was doing what the city always did, indifferent and continuous. And up here the light was going golden, and something was beginning that neither of them was going to hurry. Spring announced itself properly in April. She noticed it first in the garden, the wisteria beginning to push its first leaves, the espaliered roses showing color at the tips, the kitchen garden section beginning to suggest what it would be in another month. She'd started keeping a record of it, the garden's progression, not formally, just in the notebook she'd always kept beside her translation work, the running document of her thoughts that had been part of her since university. She wrote about the wisteria and the roses and the particular quality of April light on old stone, and she thought but did not write about the man who had planted all of it and who came to stand beside her in the garden on mornings when her translation work was finished and said, when she asked what something was, not just its name but its history, where it had come from, when it had been planted, what season it had first flowered. She was translating a novel. This was the work she'd been doing before the wedding, before the river, and it had resumed naturally, filling the mornings with the particular focused pleasure of moving between two languages, finding the exact equivalent that carried not just meaning, but texture, the undertone, the specific weight of a word in its original that was not quite the same as any single word in the target language, but could be approximated by the right combination. She worked at a desk in the room Riven had cleared for her on the second floor, her own books on the shelves, her own lamp on the desk, the window facing the garden. The room had been other things before her. She understood this, the quality of a room that had been used thoughtfully across time, and she had made it hers without erasing what it had been, which felt right, which felt consistent with the sensibility of the house. She had dinner with Marin in the third week of April. Riven had mentioned Marin as someone she would eventually need to meet, an old member of his world, older than him, the kind of person whose position required a social architecture that he navigated with the care of someone who understood that architecture was load-bearing. He'd explained the politics carefully, in the same way he explained everything, with precision and without making it feel like a test. There were those who opposed the presence of humans in the old world. There were those who were indifferent. And there were those, fewer than he would prefer, who had long held that the separation was a mistake, that the two worlds had always been more entangled than either pretended. Marin was in the third category, and had been for 4 centuries. She was small and white-haired, and looked at Sarah across the dinner table with pale eyes that had been looking at things for a very long time, and had become expert at determining which things were worth looking at. He found you in a river, Marin said. Not a question. I found myself in a river, Sarah said. He found me after. Marin looked at her. That distinction matters to you. Yes, Sarah said. I went in of my own volition. The circumstances were improvised, but the choice was mine. A silence. Then, with the quality of someone setting down a verdict, good. Passivity is dangerous in this world. It attracts the wrong kind of attention. Whose attention? Sarah said. Marin told her, the same information Riven had given her from a different angle, with an older perspective. The families who opposed. The history of what opposition had looked like across the centuries. The ways in which the old world had applied pressure to the human connections that complicated its politics. She told it plainly, without drama, the way old people told difficult histories when they'd had enough time to see the pattern clearly. "You're not frightened," Marin said, when she'd finished. "No," Sarah said. "Why not?" Sarah thought about it. "Because I left a life that was theoretically safe and practically suffocating," she said. "The threats here are at least honest about being threats." Marin looked at her for a long moment, looked at Riven, who was at the other end of the table conducting a careful parallel conversation with two others. Looked back at Sarah. "She'll do," she said. Sarah understood this was the highest available rating. "On the way home, in the car," Riven said, "Marin approves of you." She said, "I'll do," Sarah said. "I'm choosing to interpret that generously. It should be interpreted generously," he said. "I have known Marin for 200 years. She has approved of 3 people." Sarah looked at the city through the window. "Am I the third?" she said. Yes, she thought about that. About being third in a list of 3 across 2 centuries. About what had qualified the others, and what apparently qualified her, and what it said about Marin's criteria, and about Riven's history, with all 3. The others, she said. Were they like me? Humans who came in from outside? One was, he said. One was born into the world. Different circumstances, different era. What happened to them? He was quiet for a moment. They both died, he said, as humans do. The old grief quality, present as always, absorbed and carried. Marin approves of people she thinks are worth what it will cost him when they're gone. Sarah looked at the city, at the streets going past, familiar and rearranged, seen through the lens of the last 5 weeks. That's a long view, she said. Marin has an extraordinarily long view, he said. And you? She said. Is that how you think about it? He looked at her. In the low light of the car, the dark eyes very direct. I've learned not to calculate the cost before it arrives, he said. I spent a long time doing that. It doesn't help. It only takes you away from what you have, while you have it. She looked at him for a long moment. Good, she said. He held her gaze. Good, he agreed. The opposition made itself known in May. She came home from a meeting with her publisher. The translation was done, delivered the week before, and her publisher wanted to discuss the next project to find Riven in the library with 2 people she hadn't met, both of them carrying the quality of the old world, the stillness, the particular quality of being very present for a very long time. The meeting broke up as she came in. The 2 visitors left with the smooth, unhurried departure of people who had said what they came to say and were neither satisfied nor alarmed by the result. Riven stood by the window. Tell me, she said. She put her bag on the chair that was her chair and stood in the middle of the room and looked at him. He told her. 2 old families had formally objected to her presence. Not to her personally, the formal objection was structural, directed at the principle of what Riven was doing, the bringing of a human woman into the full access of his world. The objection carried specific language about contamination and exposure and the risks of the kind of entanglement that led to the kind of access she now had. What kind of access do I have? She said. Everything, he said simply. My house, my history, my world. They know the extent of it, because I haven't concealed it. Should you have concealed it? No, he said. Concealment would have been possible, but wrong. And temporary eventually concealment fails, and the exposure is worse. She looked at the window. The May garden beyond it, full green now, the wisteria just beginning to open. What do they want? She said. Specifically, a formal review of my arrangements, he said, which means a gathering of the old families to assess whether my choices represent a risk to the broader community. When? Next month. She thought about this, about Marin's dinner and the history she'd laid out, the previous oppositions, what they had looked like, about the teacher, about whom Riven had told her with the quiet weight of an old mistake, about what careful meant, in his context, and what she could do to be part of careful rather than the reason it failed. I want to be there, she said. At the review. He looked at her. I'm the reason for it, she said. My presence is the question under discussion. I should be part of the answer. It will be hostile, he said. I've had hostile, she said. I grew up with a mother who expressed love as pressure. Hostile is something I understand how to navigate. He was quiet. She could see him processing, running through whatever calculations he ran when he was deciding something. You'd need to understand the specific forms, he said, the way the old world conducts itself in formal settings, the protocols. Then teach me, she said. We have a month. He looked at her for a long time. You're not afraid of them, he said. No, she said. I'm practical. I'd rather know what I'm walking into than pretend it doesn't exist. She looked at him. The teacher, she said. The woman before. You said you moved too slowly. Didn't anticipate. Yes, he said. I'm not her, she said. I'm not going to be managed away from something I've decided to be part of, but I need to understand what we're actually dealing with. He came away from the window, sat in the chair across from hers, the position of the library, the two chairs, the space between them that had accumulated months of real exchange. Then sit down, he said. I'll tell you everything. She sat. He told her. The month that followed was the most concentrated education of her life. He taught her the structures of the old world, the family arrangements, the alliances, the specific histories that made certain relationships load-bearing and certain objections more dangerous than they appeared. She learned the formal protocols, the specific language that carried weight in the old world's meeting rooms, the things you said and the things you didn't say, and the way silence was used as a deliberate tool. She learned which of the families opposing them were primarily ideological, and which were primarily political, and which were using the ideological objection as a vehicle for something else, older grievances, older competitions, things that had nothing to do with her, but that would use her as a convenient occasion. She learned, in the process, more about him. Not through direct questioning. She had learned that direct questioning, while he always answered it, was not the primary route into the parts of him that were most real. She learned through the teaching, through the way he explained things, through the texture of what he chose to explain, and how, through the specific moments when the professional precision softened into something personal, and she could see, briefly, the weight of what he was carrying. He had been doing this alone for a very long time. Not without connection. He had made connections, had loved, had lost. But the specific work of navigating the political architecture of his world, of managing the old families and the old arrangements and the thing he'd built over centuries, the openness, the principle of contact with the human world that had been his alone, and it had cost him in ways he rarely named directly. She began to name them for him. Not intrusively. She simply started when he was explaining something that touched on the cost of it, the years of careful management, the weight of opposition that never fully resolved, saying what she observed. That it was a lot to carry alone, that maintaining a principle across centuries, in the face of people who had been opposing it since before her great-great-grandmother was born, required something she didn't have a simple word for, that she was here now, and that here now was not nothing. He would go quiet when she said these things. Not uncomfortable quiet, the quiet of someone receiving something they'd needed and weren't accustomed to receiving. On the last evening before the review, they were in the library, both reading, the familiar quiet of the room around them, and she looked up from her book and found him watching her, with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the stillness, not the attention. Something more open than both of those. Something that had set down whatever usually kept it careful. What? She said. I've been thinking about what you said, he said, when you came back from your mother's that first time, that you needed to figure out how to be yourself and also be what someone needed. She held very still. You don't do that here, he said. You don't reduce yourself. I want you to know. I've noticed. She looked at him. At the open expression, at the man who had been pulling things out of rivers and keeping them carefully, and naming them honestly for longer than she could properly imagine. I know, she said. That's why I stayed. The library was warm. Outside, the garden held its May abundance in the evening light, everything at the peak of its particular season, full and present. The review was held in a house so old it made Riven's look recent. She had expected to be nervous, and she was, in the practical way of someone walking into a situation with incomplete information and high stakes, the anxiety of the threshold rather than the anxiety of fear. She was dressed simply. Riven had not told her to dress simply, but she understood instinctively that simplicity was the right register, that anything that read as performance would work against her, that the thing most likely to be useful in this room was exactly herself, unreduced. He had said this, in almost those words, on the way there. Be exactly what you are, he'd said, what you always are. The room held 32 people. She'd learned their names, their histories, their specific positions in the architecture of what was being decided. She sat beside Riven at one end of a long table, and she looked at the faces looking back at her, and she did not perform calm. She was calm, and she let it be visible without emphasizing it. The review took 3 hours. She was asked questions, some hostile, some genuinely curious, some designed to reveal something about her that she couldn't anticipate, the old world's version of an examination. She answered honestly, precisely, without hedging, and without performance. When a question was designed to make her position seem naive, she said that she understood the concern, and then said why she disagreed with the framing. When a question was hostile, she held the person's gaze and answered it anyway. The woman who led the opposition was named Callista. She was old enough that her age was no longer something that could be gestured at with numbers, and she had been opposing the principle of human contact with the old world since before there was a formal position to oppose. She asked Sarah, at the 2-hour mark, what she thought she offered that was worth the risk she represented. The room was quiet. Sarah looked at Callista, at the pale old eyes, the certainty in them, the genuine belief behind the opposition that was also, she could see this, a form of protection, a framework built over centuries to keep something safe from the attrition of contact with a world that would not take care of it. I'm a translator, Sarah said. My work is to find the equivalent, not the literal word, but the accurate word, the one that carries what the original carried into a language that doesn't have a direct equivalent. I've spent my career on the idea that two things can be genuinely different from each other and genuinely in conversation without one consuming the other. She paused. That's not a naive position about what I am to this world. It's a description of what I think the work is. Silence, Marin. From 3 seats down. She'll do. The review ended without resolution. That was not how these things worked, Riven had explained. They concluded, and then the conclusions were considered, and then positions shifted, or they didn't, gradually, through the weight of time, and accumulated reality. But something had shifted in the room across those 3 hours. She could feel it, a slight change in the quality of attention from the faces that had started as hostile. Not won over, but considering. In the car afterward, Riven was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You were extraordinary in there." "I was exactly what I am," she said. "Yes," he said. That's what was extraordinary. She looked at the city outside, at the streets running past. "Callista," she said. "She's not wrong about the risk." "No," he said. "She's not wrong about what it is. She's wrong about whether it's worth it." "How do you know it's worth it?" He looked at her, in the low light. "Because every morning for the last 2 months," he said, "I've known you were in the house, that you were going to come downstairs and make tea and sit in the library and argue with me about something in what you were translating, and walk in the garden and ask what things are." He paused. "I've been in this world for a very long time. I know the difference between a long time with weight in it and a long time without. The last 2 months have had weight." She held that, held the specific quality of it, of being told plainly what you meant to someone, without decoration or self-protection, the way only people who had been honest for a very long time could be honest. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I know," he said. "The opposition won't change that." "I know," he said again. She looked at him. "You're mine now," she said. She said it the way he had said it, on the river steps, 2 months ago, as a statement of something already true, something being named rather than claimed. Not theirs. Not the old arrangements, not the families who want you to be only what you've always been. She held his gaze. Mine. He was very still. Then, "Yes," he said. Simply and completely. The city moved past the windows. They were almost home. She thought about the river, about the cold and the dark, and the weight of the dress pulling her down, and the thing that had pulled her up, about the steps, and the borrowed jacket, and the declaration that had arrived before she was ready for it, and that had somehow been exactly right anyway, about the 4 days that had become a week, and the week that had become 2 months, and the 2 months that had the particular quality of weight, and presence, and honest exchange that she had not found in 2 years of engagement, and had not expected to find in a house on a cobblestone hill, with a man who drew 16th century maps and kept 60-year-old vines, and went into cold rivers in good clothes without hesitating, about what it meant to be found rather than chosen, to stumble into something real rather than be guided towards something convenient. She had jumped into a river to escape a life that didn't fit. She had landed in this one. The wisteria flowered in the 3rd week of May. She came down to the garden on a Tuesday morning with her tea and her notebook, the way she came every morning when the work was going well, and she needed the transition between sleep and language, and she stopped on the path because the wall was no longer the bare structured thing it had been for months. It was covered, completely, in cascades of pale purple, thousands of small flowers hanging in dense clusters from every branch of the trained old vine, the scent arriving before she'd fully registered what she was seeing, a rich, sweet, specific scent that was not like anything else. She stood and looked at it for a long time. Then she wrote in her notebook, it took 3 years to establish itself in the new wall. Then, it became itself completely. She had been working on a new translation for 3 weeks, a different kind of novel than the last one, older, more structurally complex. A text that had been translated before but not, she felt strongly, translated well, not translated with sufficient attention to what the original was doing, with time, with duration, with the particular texture of a first-person narrator who was describing their own life from a distance of many years. She had been more interested in this project than in any translation she'd taken on in years, and she understood why, which was that the problem it was presenting her with was the problem she had been living with since March. How to render faithfully in the present tense an experience that could only be understood looking backward. Riven found her at the wall. She heard him come through the garden, the particular quality of his footsteps she'd learned months ago, and she didn't turn from the wisteria. It flowered, she said. Yes, he said. He came to stand beside her. It does this every May, for about 3 weeks. What happens after? It goes back to being a vine, he said. The structure remains. Next year it flowers again. She looked at the cascades of pale purple, at the density of it, the accumulated growth of 60 years expressing itself for 3 weeks in May. I've been thinking about the formal arrangement, she said. He was still beside her. Moran told me about it, she said. The night she came for dinner. Not as a suggestion, as information. She explained what it was and what it meant. Yes, he said. He said it carefully. The way he said things when he was managing something he cared about. She said you hadn't offered it, Sarah said. That you were waiting. Yes, he said. Why? Because it should be your idea, he said. Or at minimum your choice, made with full information, without any pressure from me. She looked at the wisteria. I want it, she said. The formal arrangement. He was quiet. Not because of the review, she said. Not because of Callista, or the opposition, or the political usefulness of it, though I understand those dimensions, and they're not irrelevant. She turned to look at him, because I've been in your house for 2 months, and I've learned how you think, and what you keep, and why you keep it, and what you've been doing alone for a very long time. And I want to be part of this properly. Not a visitor, not a managed access. I want to stand in it with you. He looked at her. The dark eyes. The quality of being looked at completely. You understand what it means, he said. The asymmetry. The duration. You told me in October, she said. Well, April. You told me in April, and I thought about it, and I told you I wasn't afraid of it. You could have more time, he said. There's no urgency. There's never urgency for you, she said, not unkindly. You have all the time. I'm the one with the limited window. She paused. I don't want to spend more of it arriving at something I've already arrived at. He was still for a long moment. The wisteria moved slightly in a May morning breeze, the pale purple cascades shifting, the scent of it moving around them. Then yes, he said. When you want. How you want. She turned back to the wisteria. They stood together in the morning garden. The old vine in its 3 weeks of full expression. The city below the hill going about its ordinary business. The house behind them warm and full, and itself. You're mine, she said again. She had started saying it the way she meant it, clearly, without qualification, the translation she'd been working toward since the river steps, the exact equivalent, in plain words, of what she understood to be true. Yes, he said. Always yes, simply, completely, the word given without reservation. And you're mine. The wisteria held its flowers in the late morning light. In 3 weeks it would go back to being a vine, the structure remaining, the roots deep in the old wall, waiting for the year to turn again and bring it back to this. She thought about the notebook entry, and about translation, and about the problem of rendering faithfully in the present tense an experience that could only be understood looking backward. She understood now that she would be understanding this for a very long time, that she would stand in this garden in other Mays and look at this vine and know that she had stood here in this one, at the beginning of it, before she understood what the structure was, when she was still only seeing the flowers. She took his hand. He looked at it, her hand in his, her warm skin against his cool, and then he looked at her, and the open expression was there, the one she'd first seen in the library the night before the review, the one that had set down whatever kept it careful. She held his hand in the wisteria-scented morning and thought about the river, the cold and the dark, and the weight of everything pulling her down, and the thing that had pulled her up and said, "You're mine now, not his." She had not known then what that meant. She knew now that it had been true before either of them had words for it, that the river had simply been the moment when the true thing became visible, the way the wisteria's flowers made visible the 60 years of root and structure that had always been there beneath. She was mine now, she thought, and I am his. And the morning was warm, and the garden was full, and the house on the hill was real and waiting, and everything that came next was going to be worth it. All of it. Every single year.